Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day. We put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark. And if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Belief does not wait for evidence, does not require justification, does not emerge from careful reasoning, but appears fully formed, arrives with conviction intact, and only afterward does the mind scramble to find reasons, to construct arguments, to build the scaffolding of rationality around a conclusion that was never reached through rationality in the first place. And this sequence is backward from what is taught, from what people believe about their own thinking, from the narrative that says humans are rational creatures who form beliefs by weighing evidence and following logic to wherever it leads. But the narrative is false, is a story the conscious mind tells about processes. It does not control and barely witnesses, because the formation of belief happens beneath awareness, happens in systems that operate according to principles that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with survival, with coalition, with identity, with the deep need to belong to a group and signal loyalty to that group through the adoption of its beliefs. And the adoption is not chosen, is not deliberate, is automatic, is the result of exposure and repetition and emotional resonance. And once a belief is formed, it becomes self-protecting, becomes resistant to challenge, becomes the lens through which all subsequent information is filtered. And the filter is not neutral, does not simply organize data, but actively distorts it, amplifies what confirms, and minimizes what contradicts. And this distortion is not dishonesty, but cognition, is the normal operation of a mind that is not designed to find truth, but to maintain coherence, to protect existing beliefs from disintegration, to avoid the cognitive and social costs of changing one's mind. And the costs are high, are often higher than the costs of being wrong, because being wrong in private is invisible, but changing one's mind in public is betrayal, is defection, is the signal that one is unreliable, is not committed, is willing to abandon the group. And groups punish this, punish uncertainty, punish the appearance of wavering, reward certainty even when the certainty is unjustified, especially when it is unjustified. Because justified certainty requires evidence, and evidence is ambiguous, and ambiguity is threatening to group cohesion, but unjustified certainty, certainty that comes from faith, from commitment, from identity, is the strongest signal of loyalty, is the proof that one believes not because the evidence compels, but because the group demands, and this demand is the engine of belief, is what makes convictions stick, what makes them resistant to argument, what makes smart people believe wrong things, not despite their intelligence, but because of it, because intelligence is a tool, and tools can be used for any purpose, including the purpose of defending beliefs that were never formed through intelligence in the first place. And the defense is sophisticated, is elaborate, is often more complex than the defenses offered by less intelligent believers, because the intelligent mind has more resources, more information, more ability to construct rationalizations that sound convincing, that appear logical, that give the impression of having been arrived at through careful thought when really they are working backward from a conclusion that was never in question. And the conclusion was never in question because it was not a conclusion but a premise, was not the end of reasoning but the beginning, was the starting point that determined which evidence would be noticed, which arguments would be persuasive, which authorities would be trusted. And trust is not distributed evenly across all sources, but is allocated according to alignment, according to whether the source supports the belief or challenges it. And sources that support are credible, are reliable, are worth listening to, while sources that challenge are biased, are corrupt, are motivated by hidden agendas. And this asymmetry is not recognized by the believer, is not seen as bias but as discernment, as the ability to distinguish good information from bad. And the distinguishing is easy because good information is information that confirms, and bad information is information that contradicts. And this is motivated reasoning, is the process by which the mind arrives at the conclusions it wants to arrive at while maintaining the illusion of objectivity, the sense that the conclusion was forced by evidence rather than selected in advance, and the illusion is convincing, is believed by the person doing the reasoning, is not cynical manipulation, but sincere self-deception, is the mind fooling itself, because being fooled is useful, is adaptive, is what allows people to hold beliefs with confidence, even when the beliefs are unsupported, and confidence is what matters socially, is what others respond to, is what makes a belief persuasive, not because it's true but because it's held strongly, and strength of conviction is mistaken for strength of evidence, is treated as signal that the believer knows something, has access to information, has done the thinking, when really the strength comes from identity, from the fact that the belief is tied to who the person is, to what group they belong to what side they are on. And sides are not chosen through reasoning, are chosen through affiliation, through accidents of birth and circumstance, through exposure to certain narratives at formative moments. And once the side is chosen, the beliefs come with it, come as package, come as the price of membership. And the price is paid gladly, because membership is worth more than truth, is worth more than accuracy, is the thing that makes life meaningful, that provides identity, that offers protection. And protection requires conformity, requires that everyone in the group believes the same things, or at least claims to believe them. And the claiming becomes believing through repetition, through public commitment, through the performance of belief that eventually converts into genuine conviction. And the conversion happens without awareness, happens gradually, happens through the mechanism that psychologists call cognitive dissonance reduction, where the mind alters beliefs to match behavior because behavior is harder to change, is more visible, is more socially consequential, and so the internal adjusts to match the external, and what was performed becomes believed, and what was believed becomes identity. And identity is the deepest level, is the level at which challenge feels like attack, like assault on the self, and the self defends, mobilizes resources, recruits intelligence in service of protection, and intelligence is effective, is dangerous in this role, because it can construct arguments that are superficially compelling, that exploit real ambiguities in evidence, that find the weak points in opposing positions. And these arguments are not offered in search of truth, but in defense of identity. Our weapons, not tools, are designed to win, not to discover, and winning means making the other side look wrong, look foolish, look motivated by bias. And the accusation of bias is always available, is always applicable, because everyone is biased, everyone is motivated, everyone is reasoning from premises they did not choose and cannot justify except by appeal to other premises they also did not choose. And so the accusations are symmetrical, are hurled back and forth without resolution, without movement, without any possibility of convergence, because convergence would require both sides to treat truth as the goal, to be willing to change their minds if evidence demanded it. But evidence never demands anything. Evidence is passive, is interpreted, is filtered through the beliefs that are already in place. And the beliefs that are already in place are determined by identity, by group membership, by tribal affiliation, And tribes do not care about truth, except insofar as truth claims serve tribal interests, serve to distinguish us from them, serve to mark boundaries, to maintain cohesion, to provide narratives that explain why we are good and they are bad, why our beliefs are justified and theirs are delusions. And the asymmetry is total, is never recognized as asymmetry, but always experienced as accurate perception, as seeing clearly while others are blind, and the blindness is attributed to stupidity or dishonesty or indoctrination, never to the same mechanisms that are operating in oneself, because one's own beliefs are transparent, are not seen as beliefs but as obvious facts, as the way things are, and the way things are is not up for debate, is not subject to revision, is the foundation on which everything else is built, and challenging the foundation threatens the structure, threatens everything. And so the challenge is rejected, is deflected, is met with hostility or mockery, or the dismissal that treats the challenger as not worth engaging, as beneath consideration, as so obviously wrong that responding would be a waste of time. And the waste is avoided, the belief is preserved, the identity is protected, and life continues with certainty intact, with the conviction that one is right, has always been right, will always be right, because being right is not a state that can be verified, but is a state that is claimed, is performed, is the stance that the group requires and the individual provides. And the providing is not sacrifice, but fulfillment, is not loss, but gain, is the way that belonging is achieved, is the way that meaning is found, is the way that the chaos of existence is organized into a coherent narrative where the self is on the right side, is part of the good, is aligned with truth, even if truth is never actually encountered, never actually sought, never actually valued except as a rhetorical weapon to use against opponents. And opponents are necessary, are required by the logic of tribal epistemology, are the ones whose wrongness confirms our rightness, whose existence justifies our beliefs, whose errors prove our accuracy, and the errors are easy to find, because looking for errors is what confirmation bias does, is the selective attention that notices everything that supports the belief and overlooks everything that contradicts it. And the overlooking is not deliberate, is not conscious suppression, but automatic filtering. Is the mind attending to what it expects, what it is primed to see? And the priming comes from belief, comes from the framework that determines what is salient, what is relevant, what is worth noticing, and what is worth noticing is always what confirms, is always what can be incorporated into the narrative, and the narrative is not discovered but constructed, is built from selected pieces of evidence that are arranged to tell a story, and the story is always the same story, is always the one where we are right and they are wrong, where our beliefs are based on evidence and theirs are based on bias, where we are rational and they are emotional, where we are honest seekers of truth and they are motivated by power or fear, or some other corrupt motive, and the motives that are attributed to others are never attributed to the self, are never seen as operating in one's own reasoning, because one's own reasoning is transparent, is experienced as simply responding to facts, as following evidence, as arriving at conclusions that are forced rather than chosen, and the forcing as illusion is the feeling that arises when motivated reasoning is operating smoothly, when the mind has successfully convinced itself that the conclusion it wanted to reach is the conclusion that evidence demands, and the demand is retroactive, is constructed after the fact, is the rationalization that makes the belief feel justified, that allows it to be held with confidence, that enables the believer to defend it against challenge and feel virtuous in the defending. And virtue is the reward, is what makes belief feel good, feel right, feel like something more than preference, and the more than preference is what gives belief its power, its capacity to motivate action, to organize communities, to inspire sacrifice, because preference can be changed, can be updated, can be revealed as merely subjective, but belief that is felt as knowledge, as truth, as correspondence to reality, is not subject to change, is not vulnerable to challenge, is the rock on which identity is built. And the rock is not geology but psychology, is not objective but constructed, is not discovered in the world but imposed on the world. And the imposition is what makes the world intelligible, what makes experience coherent, what prevents the vertigo of radical uncertainty. And uncertainty is intolerable, is the state that humans will do almost anything to avoid, will believe almost anything to escape. And the escape is into certainty, into conviction, into the feeling of knowing. And the feeling is what matters, is what provides comfort, is what makes belief functional regardless of whether it is true. And truth is a secondary concern, is something that is appealed to but not pursued, is a value that is claimed but not practiced. Because practicing it would require epistemic humility, would require admitting that one could be wrong, that one's beliefs could be mistaken, that the group could be misguided. And these admissions are costly, are signals of weakness, are invitations for opponents to attack. An attack is what happens when certainty is dropped, when doubt is expressed, when the fortress of belief shows cracks and the cracks are not tolerated, are repaired immediately, are filled with rationalizations and justifications, and appeals to authority. And authority is not expertise but alignment, is not knowledge but membership, is the voice of the group speaking through individuals who have internalized its beliefs so thoroughly that they cannot distinguish their own thoughts from the thoughts they were given. And the giving is not noticed, is not experienced as indoctrination, but as education, as the transmission of knowledge, as the inheritance of wisdom. And wisdom is what every group claims to possess, is the special access to truth that justifies its existence, that explains why belonging matters, why loyalty is required, why defection is unforgivable. And the unforgivable is treated with expulsion, with shunning, with the withdrawal of recognition that makes social existence possible. And the possibility of this withdrawal is what keeps believers in line, keeps them performing the beliefs, even when doubt arises, even when evidence contradicts, even when the rational part of the mind recognizes that the belief is unsupported, because the rational part is weak, is outvoted by the social part, by the emotional part, by the parts that understand that survival depends on belonging, and belonging depends on belief. And so belief is maintained, is performed, is protected against challenge, not because it is true, but because it's necessary, is the price of membership, is the cost of identity, and the cost is paid continuously, is paid in the suppression of doubt, in the dismissal of contrary evidence, in the construction of elaborate rationalizations that allow the belief to persist despite its failures, despite its contradictions, despite the mounting evidence that it is wrong, and wrong is what every belief eventually becomes, is the fate of all convictions that are held rigidly, that refuse to update, that treat themselves as final, as complete, as not subject to revision, because the world changes, because evidence accumulates, because what was plausible becomes implausible, and the implausible becomes undeniable, and the undeniable is denied anyway, is rejected through the mechanisms of motivated reasoning that are so powerful, so sophisticated, so effective at maintaining belief in the face of counter-evidence that they can preserve convictions long after those convictions have ceased to correspond to anything in reality. And the lack of correspondence does not matter, does not affect the strength of belief, does not reduce confidence, because belief is not about correspondence, is not about mapping the world accurately, is about maintaining identity, maintaining belonging, maintaining the narratives that make the group cohere. And coherence is more important than accuracy, is more valuable than truth, is what holds communities together, what makes collective action possible, what allows humans to coordinate at scale. And scale requires shared belief, requires that everyone is operating from the same assumptions, the same frameworks, the same narratives, and the sharing is not achieved through evidence, but through repetition, through ritual, through the constant reinforcement of the beliefs that define the group. And the reinforcement is everywhere, is in the stories that are told, the heroes that are celebrated, the enemies that are vilified, the history that is remembered and the history that is forgotten, and the remembering and forgetting are selective, are curated to support the narrative, to make the group look good, to make its beliefs seem justified, seem necessary, seem like the only reasonable position. And reasonableness is performance, is the appearance of having arrived at belief through rational process, when really the process is post hoc, is the construction of justification for conclusions that were reached through identity, through emotion, through the non-rational processes that govern most of human belief. And the most is almost all, is the vast majority of what people believe, is believed not because evidence compels, but because believing is required, is expected, is the condition of membership in the groups that provide meaning and purpose and protection. And without these groups, the individual is lost, is isolated, is without framework, without narrative, without the stories that make sense of suffering, that explain why things happen, that provide hope that the future will be better, or at least that the struggle is meaningful. And meaning is what belief provides, is the primary function, is more important than accuracy, more valuable than truth. Because humans can tolerate being wrong, but cannot tolerate meaninglessness, cannot survive without the sense that life is going somewhere, that actions matter, that the side they are on is the right side, and the right side is always the side they are on, is always the group they belong to, is determined by belonging rather than determining it. And this circularity is invisible, is not recognized as circularity, but experienced as logical necessity, as the way things obviously are. And the obvious is what is most suspect, is what most needs examination, is where belief is most rigid, most defended, most immune to challenge, because the obvious is the foundation, is the premise that cannot be questioned without everything else collapsing, and collapse is unacceptable, is the threat that keeps belief in place, that makes certainty feel like safety and doubt feel like danger. And so certainty wins, always. Wins not because it is right, but because it is functional, is what the mind needs to operate, to make decisions, to navigate the world. And navigation does not require truth, only requires consistency, requires beliefs that are stable enough to be acted upon. And stability is what identity provides, is what tribal epistemology achieves, is the freezing of belief into doctrine, into dogma, into the unquestionable truths that define the group and exclude the other. And exclusion is the point, is the function, is what makes identity possible. Because identity is not what you are, but what you're not, is defined by boundaries, by the line that separates us from them, believers from heretics, the enlightened from the deluded. And the delusion is always on the other side, is always what they suffer from, never what afflicts us, because we see clearly we have truth, we are right, and the rightness is not a conclusion but a premise, is not the end of inquiry, but the foreclosing of inquiry, is the state that belief aims for and maintains through every mechanism available, through confirmation bias, through motivated reasoning, through tribal epistemology, through the subordination of truth to identity. And the subordination is complete, is total, is the condition of believing anything at all. Because belief without evidence is not the exception, but the rule is not a failure of reasoning, but the normal operation of minds that are not designed for truth, but for survival, for belonging, for the construction of narratives that make life bearable. And bearable is all that is required, is all that can be expected, is the standard that belief meets regardless of whether it meets any other standard, and other standards are luxuries, are the concerns of those who have the security to question, to doubt, to examine their beliefs, without fearing the social consequences. But most do not have this security. Most cannot afford doubt, cannot risk uncertainty, cannot survive without the conviction that they are right, that their beliefs are justified, that the group they belong to has access to truth. And the access is never demonstrated, never verified, never subjected to test, is only asserted, only performed, only maintained through the constant repetition of the beliefs that constitute the group. And the constitution is circular, is self-referential, is the tautology that defines all tribal epistemology. That we are right because we believe what we believe, and we believe what we believe because we are right. And the circle is unbreakable from within, can only be seen from outside. From the perspective of someone who does not share the belief, who has not internalized the identity, who can see the mechanisms operating, and the seeing changes. Nothing convinces no one, because the believer is not operating from evidence and cannot be swayed by evidence, is operating from identity and can only be swayed by changes in identity, by shifts in belonging, by the rare and difficult transformation that allows a person to leave one group and join another, to abandon one set of beliefs and adopt another. And the adoption is not reasoned, but is the same non-rational process operating in a different direction, is the formation of new convictions without evidence, is the replacement of one certainty with another certainty. And the certainty is what matters, is what the mind needs, is what belief provides, regardless of content, regardless of truth, regardless of anything except the function of making the world intelligible, making the self coherent, making belonging possible. And possibility is all that belief promises, is all that it delivers, is the opening of a space where life can be lived with conviction, with purpose, with the sense that one knows what is true and what is false, what is good and what is evil, what side to be on and what side to oppose, and the opposition is necessary, is required by the structure of belief, is what makes belief matter, what gives it weight, what makes it worth defending, worth fighting for, worth holding on to, even when every rational consideration suggests it should be abandoned, because abandoning belief is abandoning identity, is abandoning belonging, is abandoning meaning, and meaning is what makes existence tolerable, is what makes life worth living. And this worth is not measured in truth, but in function, not in correspondence, but in coherence, not in accuracy, but in the capacity to organize experience into narratives that can be shared, that can be believed, that can be held, with the conviction that comes not from evidence but from faith. And faith is not the opposite of reason, but its foundation is the ground on which all reasoning occurs, is the set of premises that cannot themselves be justified but must be assumed, must be taken on faith, must be believed without evidence, because evidence requires premises, and premises require faith, and the faith is inescapable, is built into the structure of belief, is what makes belief possible, is what makes the mechanics of belief mechanical, automatic, operating below awareness, producing convictions that arrive fully formed and are only later dressed in the clothing of reason, given the appearance of having been derived from evidence when really they were derived from identity, from belonging, from the deep and desperate human need to be part of something larger, to believe something strongly, to know with certainty, even if the knowing is illusion, and the certainty is performance, and the belief is wrong. Every culture sees itself as the center, as the normal, as the standard against which all others are measured. And this seeing is not perception, but is construction, is not discovery, but is projection, is the way that collective consciousness creates a mirror that reflects not what is there, but what needs to be there, what the culture needs to believe about itself in order to maintain coherence, to justify its existence, to explain why it is the way it is and why that way is right, is natural, is superior to the ways of others. And the superiority is not argued, but is assumed, is the unexamined premise that underlies all cultural self-understanding, is the narcissism that is not individual, but is collective, is the belief that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional, and the exceptional is what every culture believes about itself, is the myth that every nation tells, is the story that makes the culture cohere, that gives members a sense of belonging, of pride, of being part of something that matters. And the mattering is created through the mirror, through the reflection that shows not reality, but idealization. Not what is, but what is imagined. Not the truth, but the narrative. And the narrative is selective, is editing out what does not fit, is highlighting what confirms, is creating the image that the culture wants to see, needs to see, must see in order to function. And the functioning requires this distortion, requires this narcissism, because without it the culture would have to confront its ordinariness, its contingency, its lack of cosmic significance. And the lack is unbearable, is threatening to the collective sense of worth, is undermining the pride that holds the group together. And so the mirror is maintained, is polished, is defended against any reflection that might show something different, something less flattering, something true. And the truth is what the mirror hides, is what the distortion prevents, is what the narcissism protects against. Because the truth is that every culture is just one culture among many, is not special, is not chosen, is not superior, is just a particular arrangement of customs and beliefs and practices that happen to emerge in a particular place at a particular time. And that could have been otherwise. And the otherwise is what cannot be acknowledged, is what the mirror does not show, is what the myth denies, because acknowledging contingency is admitting that the culture is not necessary, is not inevitable, is not the fulfillment of destiny, but is just accident, just history, just the result of forces that have nothing to do with the culture's self-understanding. And the self-understanding is what the mirror creates, is what the myth provides, is the story that makes the culture make sense, that explains why things are the way they are, that justifies the structures, the hierarchies, the inequalities that characterize every culture. And the justification is necessary, is required, is what prevents revolution, what maintains order, what ensures that those who benefit from the arrangement continue to benefit, and those who suffer continue to accept their suffering as natural, as deserved, as the way things must be. And the must is the mythology, is the claim to necessity, is the insistence that this culture, this arrangement, this way of being is not just one way, but is the way, is the correct way, is the superior way. And the superiority is demonstrated through comparison, through the creation of the other, through the projection onto outsiders of everything that the culture rejects in itself, everything that threatens the idealized image, everything that the mirror cannot reflect without shattering. And the shattering is what must be prevented, is what the other makes possible by absorbing all the negativity, all the qualities that the culture denies having, all the characteristics that are incompatible with the myth. And the incompatible is projected outward, is placed onto foreigners, onto enemies, onto those who are different. And the difference is constructed, is exaggerated, is made to seem absolute when it is relative, is made to seem essential when it is superficial, is made to seem threatening when it is merely unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar is what the culture cannot tolerate, cannot integrate, cannot acknowledge without threatening the narrative, without disturbing the reflection, without revealing that the mirror is distorting, is lying, is showing not reality, but fantasy. And the fantasy is collective, is shared, is believed, not because evidence supports it, but because the culture requires it, requires the belief that we are good, are just, are noble, are superior. And the superior is the story that every empire tells, is the myth that every dominant culture maintains, is the narrative that justifies conquest, exploitation, domination. Because if we are superior, then we have the right to rule, have the obligation to civilize, have the duty to spread our ways to those who are inferior, who are backward, who are lacking what we have. And what we have is not just wealth or technology or power, but is virtue, is morality, is the right way of being human. And the right way is our way, is the only way, is the way that must be imposed on others for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our mirror shows, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not questioned internally, is not doubted by members, is accepted as truth as obvious as the way things are. Because the culture has been internalized, has been absorbed, has become the framework through which reality is perceived, and perception is always filtered, is always shaped by the categories that culture provides, by the concepts that language offers, by the narratives that mythology supplies, and the supply is constant, is reinforced through education, through media, through the rituals that celebrate the culture, through the symbols that represent it, through the history that is taught, and the teaching is selective, is presenting only the parts that confirm the narrative, that support the myth, that maintain the reflection, and the reflection shows heroes, shows triumphs, shows progress, shows the culture moving toward perfection, toward the realization of its values, toward the fulfillment of its destiny. And the destiny is what the myth claims, is the belief that the culture is not just existing, but is going somewhere, is fulfilling a purpose, is playing a role in a larger story. And the story is always about us, is always centered on our experience, is always presenting our perspective as the perspective, our values as the values, our way as the way. And the way is not recognized as particular, but is experienced as universal, is not seen as one option among many, but is felt as the natural, the normal, the correct. And the correct is what blindness produces, is what the mirror creates, is the inability to see that the reflection is distorted, that the image is idealized, that the narrative is selective, and the selective is what creates the blind spots, is what prevents the culture from seeing its own violence, its own exploitation, its own contradictions, because these do not fit the narrative, do not confirm the myth, do not appear in the mirror, and so they are not seen, are not acknowledged, are not integrated into the culture's self-understanding, and the understanding remains partial, remains distorted, remains narcissistic. And the narcissism is not pathological in the individual sense, but is structural, is built into the way that cultures function, is necessary for cohesion, for identity, for the maintenance of boundaries. Because without the belief that we are special, the culture would dissolve, would fragment, would lose the binding force that makes a collection of individuals into a collective. And the collective requires mythology, requires shared stories, requires the mirror that reflects not individuals, but the group, not reality, but the ideal, not what is, but what is imagined. And the imagined is powerful, is shaping behavior, is creating expectations, is defining roles, is organizing life. And the organization is not neutral, is not innocent, is serving interests, is maintaining hierarchies, is justifying inequalities. Because the mythology always benefits some more than others, always privileges certain positions, always legitimates certain arrangements. And the legitimation is what the mirror provides, is what the myth accomplishes, is the conversion of contingent social arrangements into natural necessities of historical accidents, into inevitable developments of particular values, into universal truths. And the truths are not true, but are believed, are accepted, are acted upon. And the acting upon is what makes them real, in a sense, is what gives them power, is what makes them consequential. Because collective beliefs shape collective action, shape policy, shape war, shape empire. An empire is always justified through mythology, is always presenting itself as bringing civilization, bringing progress, bringing enlightenment to those who lack it. And the lack is projected, is assumed, is what the mirror does not show about the empire itself, which is that what it brings is often destruction, is exploitation, is the imposition of its ways onto others who did not ask for them, do not want them, are harmed by them, but the harm is not seen, is not reflected in the mirror, is not part of the narrative, because the narrative is about benevolence, about mission, about the burden that the superior must bear, and the burden is the story that Kipling told, is the myth that empires use, is the claim that domination is duty, that conquest is care, that exploitation is education. And the education is the transfer of culture, is the spreading of the superior ways, is the civilizing mission that justifies everything, that makes violence noble, that makes theft righteous, that makes subjugation liberation. And the liberation is what the empire claims to bring, is what its mythology proclaims, is what its mirror reflects. And the reflection is believed not just by rulers, but by the ruled, not just by exploiters, but by the exploited, because the mythology is totalizing, is pervasive, is shaping consciousness, is providing the categories through which experience is understood. And understanding within the mythology confirms the mythology, is circular, is self-reinforcing, is making it difficult to see outside, to recognize the distortion, to notice that the mirror is lying, and the lying is not intentional, is not conspiracy, is structural, is the way that collective narcissism operates, is the inevitable result of cultures needing to see themselves as good, as just, as right. And the right is always defined by the culture itself, is always reflecting back what the culture wants to see, is never showing what the culture is afraid to see, which is its own violence, its own hypocrisy, its own contingency. And the contingency is what every national myth denies, is what every claim to exceptionalism rejects, is the recognition that this culture could have been otherwise, that its values are not universal, but are particular, that its supremacy is not deserved, but is the result of power, of conquest, of accident. And the accident is what cannot be admitted, is what the mythology covers, is what the mirror hides, because admitting accident is admitting that the culture is not special, is not chosen, is not fulfilling destiny, but is just existing, just happening, just being one arrangement among many possible arrangements. And the many is what threatens, is what the other represents, is what must be denied in order to maintain the belief that we are the center, are the standard, are the measure. And the measure is how cultures see others, is how they project onto difference. Everything they reject in themselves is how they create the barbarian, the savage, the backward, the enemy. And the enemy is necessary, is required by the mythology, is what defines the culture by contrast, is what makes us good by being bad, is what makes us civilized by being savage, is what makes us superior by being inferior. And the inferior is not discovered but is created, is constructed through the selection of differences, through the exaggeration of contrasts, through the interpretation of practices as evidence of backwardness. And the backwardness is what justifies intervention, justifies domination, justifies the spreading of our ways, because if they are backward, then they need us, need our help, need our civilization. And the civilization is what we bring, what we impose, what we force upon them for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our values dictate, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not listening, is not dialogue, is not exchange, is imposition, is violence, is the erasure of their culture in the name of bringing them ours. And the erasure is not seen as violence, but is seen as progress, is seen as liberation, is seen as the inevitable movement toward the universal, which is really the particular disguised as universal, is our particular values presented as the values, our particular ways presented as the way, our particular culture presented as culture itself. And culture itself is what we believe we are, is what the mirror shows, is what the mythology claims, that we are not just a culture, but our culture, are not just civilized, but our civilization, are not just one way of being human, but are the way, the correct way, the superior way. And the superiority is what cannot be questioned internally, is what is taboo to doubt, is what is defended violently when challenged. Because challenging the myth is challenging the culture's identity, is threatening the collective narcissism, is disturbing the mirror, and the mirror must be maintained, must be protected, must be polished, because without it, the culture would have to see itself as it is, would have to confront its ordinariness, its violence, its contradictions. and the contradictions are everywhere, are visible to outsiders, are obvious to those who are not invested in the mythology, but are invisible to insiders, are not reflected in the mirror, are edited out of the narrative, are the blind spots that every culture has, that every mythology creates, that every collective narcissism requires, because seeing the contradictions would require changing, would require admitting error, would require acknowledging that the culture is not what it claims to be, is not as good as it believes, is not as just as it proclaims, and the proclaiming is constant, is part of the mythology, is the endless assertion that we are different, are better, are special, are the exception to the patterns that govern other cultures. And the exception is what every empire believes, is the myth of American exceptionalism, of British civilizing mission, of French universal values, of every dominant culture that has ever existed, each believing that it is different, that it is not like the empires that came before, that its domination is justified where others were not, that its violence is necessary where others was cruel, that its expansion is liberation where others was conquest. And the difference is illusion, is projection, is the mirror showing what the culture needs to see, which is that we are good, are noble, are doing what is right, and the right is whatever we are doing, is whatever serves our interests, is whatever maintains our power, and the power is presented as service, as burden, as duty, and the duty is what the mythology creates, is the belief that we must spread our ways, must bring our civilization, must impose our order, because without us the world would be chaos, would be darkness, would be backward, and the backward is where others are, is what defines them, is what justifies our dominance, and the dominance is not called dominance, but is called leadership, is called guidance, is called help. And the help is not asked for, is not wanted, is imposed, is forced, is the violence that the mirror does not show, that the mythology does not name, that the culture does not see, because seeing it would require shattering the mirror, would require abandoning the myth, would require confronting the collective narcissism. And the confronting is what cannot happen, is what is too threatening, is what would destroy the culture's sense of itself. And the sense of itself is what the culture is the only coherence it has, is the mythology that makes it a culture rather than just a collection of people. And so the mirror is maintained, the myth is preserved, the narcissism continues, and the culture sees itself as it needs to see itself, as special, as superior, as exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the distorted reflection that is mistaken for reality, is the mirror stage of culture where the culture is forever trapped, forever seeing the idealized image, forever believing the mythology, forever blind to the contradictions, forever projecting onto others what it cannot acknowledge in itself, forever creating the other who absorbs the negativity, who represents the threat, who justifies the violence, and the violence continues, the mythology persists, the mirror remains, and cultures continue to see themselves as the center, as the standard, as the exception, and the exception is the lie, is the delusion, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every mythology maintains, that every mirror reflects, and the reflecting is distorting, is hiding, is preventing the culture from seeing what it is, from acknowledging its contingency, from recognizing its violence, from confronting its contradictions, from shattering the mirror, from abandoning the myth, from giving up the narcissism. And the giving up is impossible, is what cultures cannot do, is what would mean their dissolution, their end, their transformation into something else. And the something else is what is feared, is what the mythology prevents, is what the mirror hides, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is the function, is what the distorted reflection accomplishes, is what makes cultures culture, is what allows collective identity, is what creates the binding force, and the force is mythology, is narrative, is the mirror that shows not truth, but need, not reality, but fantasy, not what is, but what must be believed. And the belief is collective, is shared, is the myth that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional. And the exceptional is the delusion, is the mirror stage of culture, is the permanent condition of collective consciousness, is the way that societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives. And the narratives are false, are projections, are narcissistic, and the narcissism is structural, is necessary, is what makes culture possible, is what creates cohesion, is what maintains the illusion that we are the center, are the standard, are the measure, and the measure is the mirror, is the myth, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every society maintains, that every empire believes, that every nation proclaims. And the proclaiming is the distortion, is the reflection, is the mirror stage where culture is trapped, where it sees itself not as it is, but as it needs to be, not as truth, but as mythology, not as one among many, but as the one, the exceptional, the special, the superior. And the superior is the lie, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs for itself, where it reflects its own image, where it sees only what it wants to see. And what it wants to see is that it matters, that it is right, that it is good. And the good is the reflection, is the myth, is the collective narcissism, is the mirror stage of culture where every culture is trapped, where every society remains, where every empire believes its own mythology, and the mythology is the mirror, is the distortion, is the way that cultures see themselves, as exceptional, as special, as superior. And the superior is the delusion, is the projection, is the narcissism, is the mirror stage that never ends, that continues forever, that defines culture, that creates the blind spots, that maintains the myth, that polishes the mirror, that reflects the lie. And the lie is believed, is shared, is what makes culture culture. And culture is the mirror, is the stage, is the collective narcissism, is the distorted reflection, is the mythology, is the illusion that we are exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the mirror stage of culture that shows not truth but need, not reality but fantasy, not what is but what must be seen. And the seeing is distorted, is narcissistic, is collective, is the way that cultures see themselves, forever, inevitably, necessarily, as the center, as the standard, as the exception. And the exception is the myth, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs, where it reflects, where it believes its own lies, and the lies are the culture, are the mythology, are the collective narcissism, are the mirror stage that every society inhabits, that every culture maintains, that every empire believes. And the believing is the distortion, is the reflection, is the way that cultures see themselves as exceptional when they are ordinary, as superior when they are equal, as chosen when they are contingent. And the contingent is what the mirror hides, is what the myth denies, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is permanent, is structural, is what makes the mirror stage of culture eternal, inevitable, universal. The way that all societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives that are believed, that are shared, that are maintained, that are the culture, that are the mirror, that are the stage, that are the collective narcissism that defines human social existence, that creates the blind spots, that justifies the violence, that maintains the myth, that every culture exhibits, that every society believes, that every empire proclaims. And the proclaiming is the mirror, is the stage, is the distorted reflection that is culture seeing itself. Death is not the opposite of life, but is its condition, is not the ending that comes after, but is the pressure that shapes everything, is the fact that makes every moment matter or makes nothing matter, depending on perspective, depending on whether the awareness of mortality is conscious or is repressed, is acknowledged or is denied, and the denial is the default, is the way that most humans live most of the time, is the forgetting of death that allows daily life to proceed, that allows plans to be made, that allows the future to seem real, to seem like something that will arrive, that will be inhabited, when really the future is uncertain, is not guaranteed, is always potentially not happening because death is always possible, is always near, is the horizon that surrounds every moment, even though the horizon is not seen, is not acknowledged, is pushed to the edges of consciousness, where it operates without being noticed. And the operating is what terror management theory describes, is what Ernest Becker analysed, is what philosophers from Epicurus to Heidegger have recognised, which is that death is the organising principle, is the fact that structures behaviour, that shapes culture, that creates the need for meaning, for legacy, for something that will persist beyond the mortal body, beyond the temporary consciousness, beyond the brief flicker of existence that is a human life. And the brevity is what mortality means, is the recognition that time is finite, that the days are numbered, that eventually, inevitably, certainly the ending will come. And the coming is what humans cannot accept, cannot tolerate, cannot integrate into consciousness without the help of mechanisms that soften the blow, that make death seem distant, that create the illusion of immortality through legacy, through children, through achievements, through the leaving of marks that will persist, that will remain, that will mean that the person was here, mattered, existed in a way that death cannot erase. And the erasing is what death does, is the return to nothing, is the elimination of the perspective, the ending of the experience, the cessation of being, and being is what consciousness is the only thing that is known directly, is the only certainty, and death is the end of certainty, is the movement from being to not being, from existence to non-existence, from something to nothing, and the nothing is unimaginable, is not representable, is not something that can be experienced, because experience requires existence, and death is the end of existence, and so death cannot be known, cannot be prepared for, cannot be understood except as concept, as abstraction, as the thing that happens to others, but not to oneself, because oneself is always here, is always now, is always being, and being cannot imagine not being, cannot grasp what it would mean to not exist. And so the grasping fails, the imagination fails, and what remains is anxiety, is the terror that Becker named, is the fundamental horror of mortality that underlies all human striving, all cultural creation, all the symbolic systems that humans build to deny death, to transcend death, to make death seem like something other than what it is, which is the end, the absolute end, the final end. And the finality is what cannot be accepted, is what the symbolic systems are designed to obscure, to soften, to make bearable. And the bearing is what culture does, is what religion provides, is what meaning creates, is the framework that makes mortality tolerable by promising that death is not the end, is not final, is not the absolute cessation, but is transition, is passage, is the movement from this life to another life, from this world to another world, from temporality to eternity. And eternity is the solution, is the promise that makes death bearable, is the belief that the self will continue, will persist, will exist in some form beyond the death of the body. And the beyond is what religions offer, is what makes them powerful, is what makes them necessary. Because without the promise of continuation, without the belief in something after, death is unbearable, is too horrifying, is too final, and the finality is what humans flee from, is what drives the creation of culture, of meaning, of all the systems that provide the illusion of permanence in a world where nothing is permanent, where everything ends, where death is the only certainty, and the certainty is denied, is repressed, is pushed into unconsciousness, where it continues to operate, continues to shape behaviour, continues to create the anxiety that motivates striving, that produces the need for achievement, for recognition, for legacy. And legacy is the secular substitute for immortality, is the way that non-religious consciousness tries to transcend death, tries to create permanence, tries to ensure that the self will continue in some form, will be remembered, will have mattered, and the mattering is what legacy provides, is the sense that the life was significant, was important, was worth living, and the worth is measured by what remains, by what persists, by what continues after death. And the continuing is children, is works, is achievements, is anything that carries the name forward, that keeps the memory alive, that prevents the erasure that death threatens. And the threat is what drives behaviour, is what shapes choices, is what makes people desperate for significance, for impact, for the leaving of marks. And the marks are what resist death, are what deny death, are what create the illusion that death is not final, is not absolute, is not the complete erasure that it actually is. Because what persists is not the person, is not the consciousness, is not the experience, is only memory, is only representation, is only the traces left behind. And traces are not the thing, are not the person, are not continuation, but are echoes, are shadows, are the residue of a presence that is gone. And the gone is complete, is total, is the absolute ending that no legacy can reverse, no achievement can prevent, no memory can undo. And the undoing is what humans want, is what they strive for, is what they cannot have, because death is irreversible, is final, is the one thing that cannot be changed, cannot be negotiated, cannot be escaped. And the escaping is what humans are always attempting, is what drives medical science, what motivates the search for longevity, for life extension, for the postponement of death. And the postponement is possible, is achievable, is happening, is increasing lifespan, is pushing death further into the future. But the pushing is not eliminating, is not transcending, is only delaying, is only buying time. And time is what mortality is about, is the finite duration, is the numbered days, and the numbering is what creates urgency, is what makes moments precious, is what gives life its intensity. And the intensity is what would be lost if death were eliminated, if immortality were achieved, if time were infinite, because infinite time means that nothing is urgent, nothing is precious, nothing matters in the way that it matters when time is scarce, when death is near, when the ending is certain. And the certainty is what gives weight to life, is what makes choices matter, is what creates the pressure to live well, to live fully, to use the time that is available. And the available is limited, is finite, is running out. And the running out is what creates anxiety, is what produces terror, is what makes death unbearable, but is also what makes life meaningful, is what gives moments their significance, is what creates the conditions for value, for importance, for the sense that this matters. This is real. This is happening now, and will never happen again. And the never again is both the horror and the beauty of mortality, is both what makes death terrible and what makes life precious. And the precious is what immortality would eliminate, is what infinite time would destroy, because in infinite time, everything can be redone, can be repeated, can be postponed indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the loss of urgency, is the elimination of pressure, is the removal of the condition that makes life matter. And the mattering would fade, would disappear, would be replaced by ennui, by boredom, by the sense that nothing is important because everything is always available, always possible, always able to be done later, and later never comes, never needs to come, because there is always more time, always more opportunity, always more future, and the future without end is not liberation, but is prison, is not freedom but is curse, is the elimination of the one thing that makes life bearable, which is its finitude, its limit, its ending. And the ending is what humans fear most, but is also what makes everything else possible, makes meaning possible, makes value possible, makes the sense that this matters, that this is important, that this should be done now. And the now is what mortality creates, is the urgency, is the pressure, is the recognition that time is limited and must be used, must be filled, must be lived, and the living is what death makes possible, is what finitude creates, is what the awareness of mortality produces. When the awareness is not repressed, is not denied, is allowed into consciousness where it can shape behavior, not through terror but through acceptance, through the recognition that death is inevitable, and therefore life is precious, is limited, is the opportunity that will not repeat. And the not repeating is what makes each moment unique, makes each experience singular, makes each person irreplaceable. Because death means that this person, this consciousness, this particular way of being in the world will end, will cease, will never exist again. And the never again is both loss and gift, is both what is mourned and what is celebrated. Because mortality is what makes individuality possible, is what makes each person unique, is what ensures that no life is the same as any other life. And the sameness would be what immortality would produce, would be the eventual repetition, the exhaustion of novelty, the sense that everything has been done, has been experienced, has been lived through too many times. And the too many times is what infinite time produces, is the curse of repetition, is the horror of eternity, is the recognition that immortality would not be paradise, but would be hell, would be the endless continuation of existence without purpose, without end, without the relief that death provides. And the relief is what death is the ending of suffering, is the cessation of striving, is the peace that comes from completion, from finality, from the recognition that it is over, is done, is finished. And the finishing is what gives shape to life, is what makes it a story, is what creates the arc from beginning to end. And the end is what gives the beginning meaning, is what makes the middle matter, is what ensures that the story has significance, has weight, has the structure that makes it comprehensible. And comprehensible is what life becomes when death is acknowledged, when mortality is accepted, when the ending is recognized as necessary, as the condition that makes everything else possible. And the possible is what humans are living, is the space between birth and death, is the time that is given, is the opportunity to exist, to experience, to be. And the being is temporary, is finite, is ending. And the ending is approaching, is always approaching, is getting closer with every moment, with every breath, with every heartbeat. And the heartbeats are numbered, are counted, are finite. And the finite is what makes them precious, is what makes each beat matter, is what creates the urgency to live, to experience, to be fully present in the time that remains. And the remains is diminishing, is running out, is approaching zero, and the zero is death, is the ending, is the return to nothing. And the nothing is what was before birth and will be after death, is the condition from which life emerges and to which it returns. And the return is inevitable, is certain, is the one appointment that cannot be missed, cannot be postponed indefinitely, cannot be escaped. And the escaping is what modern medicine attempts, is what life extension promises, is what cryonics offers, is the denial of death through technology, through science, through the belief that death is a problem that can be solved, is a disease that can be cured, is an enemy that can be defeated. And the defeating is what death denial looks like in secular culture, is the medicalization of mortality, is the treatment of death as failure, as something that should not happen, as something to be prevented, to be delayed, to be fought against. With every resource available, and the available resources are considerable, are increasing, are pushing death further back, are extending life further forward, but are not eliminating death, are not making immortality actual, are only postponing the inevitable, are only delaying the ending. And the delaying is creating new problems, is producing extended old age, is generating years of decline, of deterioration, of the slow failing of the body and the mind. And the failing is what modern medicine has not solved, has not prevented, has only extended, has only made longer. And the longer is not always better, is not always desirable, is sometimes the prolongation of suffering, the extension of indignity, the continuation of existence beyond the point where existence is meaningful, where life is life rather than mere biological persistence. And the persistence is what modern medicine achieves, is what technology provides, is the keeping alive of bodies that would otherwise die, that should die, that are ready to die, but are prevented from dying by interventions that maintain biological function without maintaining experience, without maintaining quality, without maintaining what makes life worth living. And the worth living is what death denial sacrifices, is what the fight against mortality costs, is the recognition that sometimes death is mercy, is relief, is the appropriate ending, is what should happen. And the should is what modern culture has lost, is what medical ethics struggles with, is what the denial of death prevents from. Being acknowledged, which is that death is natural, is necessary, is the ending that gives shape to life, that makes life meaningful, that creates the conditions for value, for importance, for the sense that this matters. And the mattering is what death creates, is what mortality produces, is the mathematics that structures behaviour, that shapes choices, that organises life around the fact of ending. And the fact is undeniable, is certain, is the one truth that applies to everyone, that no one escapes, that makes all humans equal in the end. And the end is what is shared, is what connects, is what makes mortality not just individual, but collective, not just personal, but universal. Not just my death, but death itself, the death that comes for everyone. That structures all life, that creates the pressure, the urgency, the terror, the meaning, the value, the sense that time is limited and must be used, must be lived, must be filled with experience, with connection, with love, with the things that make existence worthwhile. And the worthwhile is what death makes possible, is what finitude creates, is what the mathematics of mortality reveals, which is that death is not the enemy, but is the condition, is not the opposite of life, but is its structure, is not what ends meaning, but is what creates meaning, is not what should be denied, but is what should be accepted, is what should be acknowledged, is what should be integrated into consciousness, into culture, into the way that life is lived. And the living is what matters, is what the mathematics of mortality teaches, which is that death is certain, time is finite, moments are precious, and the precious is what remains, is what persists, is the experience of being alive, of being conscious, of being here now, in the time that is given, in the space between birth and death, in the mathematics that structures everything, that creates everything, that makes everything matter. And the mattering is mortality, is death, is the ending that gives shape to life, that makes life life, that creates the conditions for meaning, for value, for the sense that this is important, that this is real, that this is happening, and the happening is temporary, is finite, is ending. And the ending is what makes it precious, is what makes it matter, is what makes it the gift that death gives, which is the recognition that life is limited, is scarce, is valuable, and the valuable is what should be lived, should be experienced, should be embraced, not denied, not postponed, not feared, but accepted, acknowledged, integrated. And the integration is what makes mortality bearable, is what transforms terror into meaning, is what converts the mathematics of death into the mathematics of life. And the life is here, is now, is finite, is ending. And the ending is approaching, is certain, is the fact that structures everything, that makes everything matter, that creates the urgency to live, to be, to exist fully in the time that remains. And the remains is diminishing, is running out, is approaching the end, and the end is death. Is the mathematics, is the certainty, is the condition, is what makes life life. And life is what matters, is what is given, is what is ending, and the ending is the gift, is the meaning, is the mathematics of mortality that structures all human behaviour, all human striving, all human meaning. And the meaning is that death is certain, life is finite, time is limited, and the limited is what makes it precious, is what makes it matter, is what makes it the only thing that matters, which is the time between now and death, the space between birth and ending, the mathematics that structures everything, that creates everything, that is mortality, that is death, that is the fact that cannot be escaped, cannot be denied, cannot be defeated, can only be accepted, acknowledged, lived with. And the living with is what makes life meaningful, is what transforms terror into purpose, is what converts the mathematics of death into the gift of life. And the gift is finite, is ending, is approaching zero. And the zero is death, is the end, is the mathematics, is the certainty, is the condition that structures everything, that makes everything matter, that creates the pressure, the urgency, the meaning. And the meaning is that life is limited, death is certain, time is running out, and the running out is what makes now matter, is what makes this moment precious, is what makes existence valuable, and the valuable is what should be lived, should be embraced, should be experienced fully. Because the mathematics of mortality reveals that death is not the enemy, but is the teacher, is not what destroys meaning, but is what creates meaning, is not what ends life, but is what makes life life, is the certainty, is the fact, is the mathematics that structures all human behaviour, all human striving, all human existence, and the existence is finite, is ending, is death, and death is the mathematics, is the meaning, is the gift, is the end. Meaning was not invented, but was given, was not constructed, but was inherited, was not the product of individual reflection, but was the air that was breathed, the framework that was absorbed, the structure that made sense of suffering, of labour, of death, of everything that otherwise would be unbearable. And this given meaning came from stories, from gods, from hierarchies that extended beyond the human into the cosmic, into realms where purposes were assigned, where roles were fixed, where every life, no matter how small, had significance, because it was part of a larger pattern, a divine plan, a cosmic order that justified suffering, that explained inequality, that made death not an end, but a transition. And the transition was to something, was leading somewhere, was part of a narrative that continued beyond the visible, beyond the mortal, beyond the contingent facts of this world, into eternal truths that grounded everything. And the grounding is what modernity has lost, is what the Enlightenment destroyed, is what science dissolved by showing that the cosmic order was projection, was fiction, was the human need for meaning imposed onto a universe that has no meaning, that cares nothing for human purposes, that operates according to laws that are indifferent to whether anyone suffers or flourishes. And the indifference is what modern consciousness must confront, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is difficult, is producing the crisis that thinkers have been naming for centuries. The meaning crisis, the disenchantment, the death of God that Nietzsche announced not as celebration, but as diagnosis, as the recognition that the framework had collapsed, that the stories no longer worked, that the gods were no longer believable. And the unbelievability was not failure of faith, but was the inevitable result of knowledge, of the scientific worldview that explained through mechanism what had been explained through purpose, that showed causes where there had been reasons, that revealed the universe to be vast and old and empty of anything like human meaning. And the emptiness is what modern consciousness inherits, is the vacuum that religion once filled, is the absence that creates the crisis, because humans need meaning, are built to seek it, are suffering without it, are experiencing the pointlessness as pathology, as depression, as the epidemic of despair that characterizes wealthy secular societies, where material needs are met but existential needs are not, where comfort is abundant but purpose is absent, where life is long but feels empty, and the emptiness is not new, but the awareness of it is new, is the result of losing the stories that made the emptiness tolerable, that covered it over, that provided the illusion of significance. An illusion is what the religious frameworks were. But they were functional illusions, were useful fictions, were false but necessary. And the necessity is what modernity has trouble acknowledging, has trouble accepting, because modernity is committed to truth, to science, to the rejection of comfortable lies, but the rejection has costs, is leaving people without the resources to make sense of existence, without the narratives that make suffering meaningful, without the structures that provide purpose. And purpose cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual will, cannot be generated by deciding to care about something, because caring requires reasons, and reasons require frameworks, and frameworks are inherited, not invented, are received, not constructed, are given by cultures, by traditions, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced the same emptiness and created stories to fill it. And the stories worked not because they were true, but because they were shared, were collective, were providing roles and meanings that were recognized by others, that were part of a social world where purpose was public, was confirmed, was real in the way that social facts are real. And social facts require agreement, require participation, require that people act as if the meaning is there. And the as if is what modernity has trouble with, is what secular consciousness resists, because acting as if seems like pretending, seems like bad faith, seems like the self-deception that Sartre warned against. And so modern individuals are caught between the need for meaning and the inability to believe in the sources of meaning, between the hunger for purpose and the knowledge that purpose is not inherent but is imposed, is constructed, is chosen. And chosen meaning feels arbitrary, feels thin, feels like it could be otherwise, and therefore feels like it is not really meaning at all, but is just preference, just a subjective valuing that has no grounding, no justification, no claim to be anything more than personal taste. And taste is not enough, is not providing the weight that meaning requires, is not making life feel significant, is not answering the question of why any of this matters. And the why is the question that modernity cannot answer, is the question that haunts secular consciousness, is the question that produces the crisis. And the crisis is not just intellectual, but is visceral, is felt, is experienced as the flatness of existence, as the sense that nothing really matters, that everything is permitted because nothing is forbidden, that values are just opinions, and opinions are just brain states, and brain states are just physics. And the physics is indifferent, is not caring, is not providing any reason to do anything, to be anything, to continue existing. And the continuing is what becomes questionable, is what the meaning crisis threatens, is why suicide rates rise, why despair spreads, why affluent societies are seeing increases in deaths of despair, in overdoses, in suicides, in all the ways that people exit when existence feels unbearable. And the unbearable is not material, but is existential, is not about lacking things, but about lacking reasons, lacking purposes, lacking the framework that makes effort meaningful, that makes suffering tolerable, that makes life worth living. And the worth is what is missing, is what cannot be found, is what modernity has destroyed without replacing. And the replacements that have been tried are failing, are not working, are revealing themselves to be inadequate substitutes for what was lost. And what was lost was not just belief in God, but was the entire worldview that made God plausible, that made divine purpose conceivable, that made cosmic meaning possible. And the possible is what has been eliminated, is what science has shown to be projection, to be anthropomorphism, to be the mistaken attribution of human qualities to the universe. And the mistake is understandable, is natural, is the way that consciousness makes sense of the world. But it is still mistake, is still error, is still something that cannot be sustained once knowledge advances, once the mechanisms are understood, once the causes are revealed and the revealing is irreversible, is not allowing return to innocence, is not permitting the restoration of belief, is creating the permanent condition of disenchantment, of knowing that the meanings are not discovered but are created, are not inherent but are imposed, and the imposed cannot carry the weight that the discovered could carry, cannot provide the grounding that the inherent provided, cannot make life feel significant in the way that cosmic purpose made it feel significant. And so modernity is searching, is trying to find secular substitutes, is trying to create meanings that do not depend on the supernatural, on the transcendent, on the stories that are no longer believable. And the substitutes that are tried are varied, are including humanism, the belief that human values are sufficient, that human flourishing is purpose enough, that making life better for people is meaning enough. But humanism is thin, is not providing the depth that religious meaning provided, is not explaining why human flourishing matters, is not grounding value in anything beyond human preference. And preference is not enough, is not answering the question of why this preference rather than another. Why care about flourishing rather than about something else? And the something else is always available, is always an option. And without grounding, the choice feels arbitrary, feels like it could be different. And what can be different feels less real, less binding, less meaningful. And so humanism satisfies some, but not others, works for those who do not need deep grounding, but does not work for those who do, who need reasons that extend beyond the human, beyond the contingent, beyond the arbitrary. And these people are searching, are trying other substitutes, are trying nationalism, the belief that the nation provides purpose, that serving the collective gives life meaning, that sacrifice for the group is the answer. But nationalism is dangerous, is leading to conflict, is producing the us versus them that justifies violence, that makes the other into enemy, that converts the search for meaning into the justification for harm. And the harm is what makes nationalism unsustainable, as meaning is what reveals it to be destructive, to be the kind of substitute that is worse than the absence it is trying to fill. And so nationalism is rejected by many, is seen as the wrong answer, but the rejection leaves the question open, leaves the search continuing. And another substitute that is tried is ideology, the belief that political movements provide purpose, that working for justice or equality or liberation gives life meaning. That commitment to the cause is the answer, and for some this works, is providing the structure that was lost, is giving roles and purposes, and the sense of being part of something larger, something important, something that justifies effort and sacrifice. But ideology is also dangerous, is also producing conflict, is also dividing the world into believers and heretics, is creating the certainty that is intolerant, that is unwilling to coexist with doubt. And the doubt is what ideology cannot tolerate, is what it must suppress. And the suppression is violence, is coercion, is the same problem that religion had, that any totalizing meaning system has, which is that it cannot allow alternatives, cannot permit questioning, cannot coexist with the plurality that modernity also values. And so ideology is failing as substitute, is producing as much harm as good, is not solving the meaning crisis, but is creating new problems, new conflicts, new reasons for despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes modern consciousness, when all the substitutes are tried and found wanting, when the search for meaning exhausts itself, when the recognition arrives that maybe meaning cannot be found, cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual or collective will, because meaning was never something that humans made, but was something they received, was given by frameworks that emerged over centuries, that were refined through generations, that worked because they were inherited. Not because they were chosen, and choosing meaning is the modern problem, is the thing that modernity demands, but that consciousness cannot do, because choice requires reasons, and reasons require grounding, and grounding is what is missing, is what was lost with the death of God, with the collapse of cosmic purpose, with the recognition that the universe is indifferent, and the indifference is the truth, is what science reveals, is what honesty requires accepting, and the acceptance is what some philosophers advocate, is what Camus called absurdism, is the response that acknowledges the meaninglessness while refusing to be destroyed by it, that confronts the absurd without fleeing into suicide or into false hope, that lives with full awareness of the void while continuing to live, while continuing to act, while continuing to find moments of joy and connection and beauty, even though none of it means anything in the cosmic sense. None of it matters beyond the moment. None of it will be remembered once consciousness ends, and the ending is inevitable, is coming for everyone, is the final proof that nothing matters, that all effort is futile, that existence is temporary and meaning is impossible. And yet the absurd response is to continue anyway, is to rebel against the meaninglessness, not by denying it, but by living in spite of it, by affirming life without justification, by finding satisfaction in the act of living itself, rather than in any purpose that living serves. And the serving is what is abandoned, is what the absurd lets go of, is what is recognized as impossible. And the impossible is what modernity must accept, must live with, must somehow survive. And the survival is not guaranteed, is not easy, is requiring a transformation of consciousness, a new way of being human that does not need cosmic meaning, that does not require divine purpose, that can tolerate the void without filling it, that can live with the knowledge that existence is contingent, that meaning is constructed, that everything could be otherwise. And the otherwise is what makes nothing necessary, nothing absolute, nothing secure, and the insecurity is the permanent condition, is what modernity offers, is what the horizon of meaning looks like when the horizon keeps receding, when the destination is revealed to be illusion, when the search is recognized as endless because there is nothing to find, no meaning to discover, no purpose to uncover, only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence of the universe that does not answer, that does not care, that does not provide what humans need. And the need is real, is not going away, is producing the crisis that may not have solution, that may be the permanent condition of secular consciousness, of enlightened awareness, of the knowledge that liberates from illusion, but enslaves to despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes the horizon of meaning in modernity. The flat landscape where purposes used to stand, where gods used to reign, where cosmic order used to justify suffering. And now there is nothing, or there is only what can be constructed, what can be chosen, what can be performed. And the performance feels hollow, feels fake, feels like going through motions, without conviction. And conviction is what is missing, is what cannot be manufactured, is what made religious meaning work. And without it, the secular substitutes fail. The humanisms and nationalisms and ideologies all fail because they lack the weight, lack the depth, lack the grounding that conviction requires. And the requires is what consciousness needs, is what makes meaning meaning rather than just preference. And preference is not enough, has never been enough, will never be enough, because humans are built for meaning, are requiring it, are suffering without it. And the suffering is the crisis, is the modern condition, is the permanent state of existence at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon is empty, is revealing nothing, is offering nothing except the recognition that meaning was always illusion, was always projection, was always the human need imposed onto a universe that provides nothing, that offers nothing, that is indifferent to whether anyone finds meaning or drowns in meaninglessness. and the drowning is happening, is visible, is the epidemic of despair, is the meaning crisis that modernity cannot solve, because the solution would require believing what cannot be believed, accepting what knowledge has revealed to be false, returning to illusions that have been seen through. And the seeing through is irreversible, is permanent, is leaving consciousness stranded at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon extends forever and reveals nothing, where the search continues because it must, but where nothing is found because nothing is there, because meaning is not discovered but was always created, was always the story that consciousness told itself, and the story has ended, has been revealed as story. And what remains is the silence, the emptiness, the void that religions were covering, that purposes were filling, that cosmic orders were organizing, and the organizing is gone, is lost, is leaving consciousness alone with existence, with the fact of being without the reason for being, with life without purpose, with experience without significance. And the without is the horizon, is what modernity sees when it looks for meaning. And the looking continues, must continue, because consciousness cannot stop seeking what it needs. But the seeking finds nothing, reveals nothing, discovers nothing except the fact that there is nothing to discover, that the horizon is empty, that meaning is absent, that purpose is impossible, and the impossible is what must be lived with, must be endured, must be survived. And the survival is what absurdism attempts, what Camus offered, what some find sufficient, but many do not. Many cannot. Many are destroyed by the emptiness, by the meaninglessness, by the recognition that nothing matters and nothing can be done to make it matter. And the cannot is the tragedy, is the modern condition, is the permanent crisis at the horizon of meaning, where meaning has ended, where purpose has collapsed, where existence continues, but significance does not. And the does not is what remains, is what persists, is what characterizes life at the horizon, where the horizon is empty, where the search reveals nothing, where consciousness is alone with its need for meaning in a universe that provides none, that offers none, that will never provide any, because meaning is not there, was never there, is only here in consciousness, in the stories that are told, in the illusions that are maintained, and the maintaining is what modernity cannot do, is what knowledge prevents, is what honesty forbids, and so the crisis continues, the despair persists, the horizon remains empty, and consciousness must somehow survive, must somehow continue, must somehow live without meaning, without purpose, without the grounding that makes existence bearable, and the bearable becomes questionable, becomes doubtful, becomes the thing that many cannot achieve, and the achieving is the challenge, is the task, is what modernity demands without providing resources, without offering solutions, without giving answers, because there are no answers, there is no solution, there is only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence, and the silence is what speaks, is what reveals, is what remains at the horizon of meaning where meaning has ended, and nothing has replaced it, and nothing ever will. Edmund Gettier wrote a 3-page paper in 1963 that destroyed 2,000 years of philosophy, not by offering a new theory, not by constructing an elaborate argument, not by marshalling evidence or appealing to grand principles, but simply by describing 2 cases, 2 simple scenarios where someone has a justified true belief that clearly is not knowledge. And these cases were so straightforward, so devastating, so impossible to dismiss, that they shattered the definition of knowledge that had stood since Plato, the definition that said knowledge was justified true belief. And in the decades since philosophers have tried to repair the damage, have proposed dozens of modifications and additions and qualifications, have added 4th conditions and 5th conditions, have distinguished types of justification and types of truth and types of belief, and none of it has worked. None of it has produced a definition that captures all and only cases of knowledge, that avoids counterexamples, that does what definitions are supposed to do, And the question is whether this failure reveals something about knowledge itself, whether knowledge resists definition not because philosophers have not been clever enough, but because definition is the wrong tool, because knowledge is not the kind of thing that can be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, because the project of analysing knowledge was misconceived from the start. The cases themselves are almost too simple. In one, a person looks at a clock that has stopped but happens to look at the moment when the stop time matches the actual time. They form a justified true belief about what time it is. The belief is true. The justification seems perfectly adequate. They looked at a clock and clocks are generally reliable. But this is not knowledge, it is luck. It is coincidence. It is the kind of situation where we want to say the person got it right but did not know. And in the other case, a person believes their colleague owns a Ford because they have seen them driving a Ford for years. They infer from this that someone in the office owns a Ford. And it turns out someone in the office does own a Ford, but it is not the colleague. It is someone else entirely. And again, there is justified true belief, but no knowledge. The justification was good. The belief was true. But the connection between justification and truth went through the wrong path, depended on a falsehood succeeded by accident rather than by the proper relation between evidence and reality. These cases reveal something philosophers had not noticed before, that justification and truth can come apart in subtle ways, that a belief can be justified and true without the justification being what makes it true, without the truth being because of the justification. And this gap, this disconnect, this possibility of luck intervening between justification and truth is what makes justified true belief insufficient for knowledge. And once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. It becomes obvious that knowledge requires not just justification and truth, but the right connection between them. Requires that the truth be non-accidental, be because of rather than merely accompanied by the justification. And this seems like it should be easy to fix, should be easy to add to the definition. Just require that the belief be justified and true, and not Gettiad, not undermined by luck, not true by accident, and problem solved. But this is where the real trouble begins, because no one can say what it means for a belief to be non-accidentally true. No one can define luck in a way that is not circular, not question-begging, not itself dependent on an intuitive grasp of what knowledge is. The natural move is to say that knowledge requires a reliable connection between belief and truth, that the method that produced the belief must be one that generally produces true beliefs. And this is reliabilism, the view that knowledge is reliably produced true belief. And this avoids Gettier cases because in Gettier cases, the belief is not reliably produced, the stopped clock is not a reliable method. The inference from the colleague's Ford to someone owning a Ford goes through an unreliable intermediate step. And so, reliabilism can say these are not knowledge because they fail the reliability condition, but reliabilism faces its own problems. It faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify the relevant type of belief. Forming process, because any process can be described at many levels of generality. Looking at a clock is a reliable process, but looking at this particular stopped clock is not. And which description is the right one? Which is the type that matters for knowledge? And there seems to be no non-arbitrary way to answer this, no principle that determines the correct level of generality. And without such a principle, reliabilism cannot be applied, cannot deliver verdicts about particular cases, cannot do the work a theory of knowledge is supposed to do. Goldman tried to solve this with proper function, with the idea that the relevant process is the one that evolution, or learning, or some other natural process designed the cognitive system to perform. And this gives a non-arbitrary way to pick out process types, but it introduces new problems. Problems about what counts as proper function, about whether knowledge requires biological or social or individual design, about whether malfunction always destroys knowledge or only sometimes. And these questions proved as difficult as the original Gettier problem, generated their own literature, their own debates, their own unresolved puzzles. Others tried causal theories, theories that said knowledge requires a causal connection between the fact and the belief, that you can only know that Pi if P causes your belief that P, and this handles some Gettier cases. The stopped clock case involves no causal connection between the actual time and the belief about the time, but causal theories face problems with knowledge of abstract objects, with mathematical knowledge, with knowledge of the future, with any case where the thing known does not seem capable of causing beliefs, and the theory had to be abandoned or modified into something so hedged with qualifications that it lost its initial appeal, its initial promise of solving Gettier with a simple, elegant condition. Nozick proposed tracking, the idea that knowledge requires that the belief track the truth, that if P were false, the person would not believe P, and if P were true in nearby circumstances, the person would believe P, and this captures something important, captures the idea that knowledge involves a kind of sensitivity to truth, a responsiveness that is missing in Gettier cases. But tracking faces problems too. Problems with closure, the principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you can know Q by inference. Because tracking does not preserve closure. You can track one truth without tracking what it entails. And this means Nozick's theory implies you can know you have hands without knowing you are not a brain in a vat. And this seems wrong, seems like a bullet too large to bite. And most philosophers rejected tracking for this reason, even while acknowledging it captured something about knowledge that justified true belief missed. The pattern repeats endlessly. Someone proposes a fourth condition, someone finds a counterexample, the condition is modified, new counterexamples appear, the modifications multiply, the theory becomes baroque, loses its explanatory power, and eventually is abandoned in favour of a new approach that promises to avoid the problems of its predecessors. And this new approach inevitably faces its own counterexamples, its own difficulties, its own descent into complexity and qualification. And after 60 years of this, the epistemological community is no closer to a widely accepted definition of knowledge than it was when Gettier published his paper. And some have begun to suspect that this is not a temporary problem, not a sign that philosophers have not been clever enough, but a permanent feature of the concept of knowledge itself, a sign that knowledge resists analysis, that it cannot be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, that the classical project of defining knowledge is not incomplete, but impossible. Williamson argued exactly this. He claimed that knowledge is primitive, that it cannot be analysed into more basic components, that it is a mental state in its own right, rather than a compound of belief and justification and truth. And this means the Gettier problem is not a problem to be solved, but a symptom of trying to do something that cannot be done, like trying to define yellow in terms of non-colour concepts, like trying to analyse consciousness into purely physical terms. And if Williamson is right, then all the attempts to fix the justified true belief analysis, all the fourth conditions and modifications and qualifications were doomed from the start. We're trying to define the undefinable, to analyse the primitive, and the right response is not to keep trying but to give up, to accept that knowledge is basic, that epistemology can still study its properties and relations without being able to define it, that not everything can be reduced to simpler components. But this seems like defeat, seems like giving up on philosophy's traditional task, and many resist it, continue to search for a definition, continue to propose new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding the connection between belief and truth that knowledge requires. And this persistence is partly admirable, partly stubborn refusal to accept limits, and partly a failure to recognise when a project has failed, when the evidence is overwhelming that the goal is unreachable, that the concept being analysed is not structured the way analysis assumes, and the question is which interpretation is correct, whether continued work on the analysis of knowledge is noble persistence or futile stubbornness, whether the next theory might finally succeed or whether success is impossible. The externalism-internalism debate intersects with all of this, because Gettier cases reveal a tension between what the believer has access to and what makes belief knowledge. The person with justified true belief in a Gettier case cannot tell from the inside that they lack knowledge, cannot distinguish their situation from genuine knowledge by introspection or reflection. And this suggests that knowledge depends on external factors, on how the belief was actually formed, on whether the process was reliable, on whether the connection to truth was proper, and these are not things the believer necessarily has access to, not things that show up in consciousness, not things that can be known by reflection alone. And this means externalism is true. Knowledge is partly constituted by factors external to the mind, by relations to the environment that the knower may not be aware of. And this is deeply counterintuitive, deeply at odds with the Cartesian picture, where knowledge is transparent to the knower, where what one knows is fully accessible to reflection, where the mental is self-intimating and clear. But Gettier forces this conclusion, forces the recognition that knowledge can depend on facts. The knower does not, and perhaps cannot know, that there can be twins who are internally identical but differ in knowledge because they differ in environment. And this seems to violate something important about the nature of mind, about the privacy of the mental, about the authority each person has over their own beliefs. Yet the alternative seems worse, seems to deny that knowledge requires any external connection to reality at all, seems to make knowledge purely a matter of internal coherence or justification, and this would allow the brain in a vat to have knowledge, would make knowledge independent of truth, would sever the connection between mind and world that knowledge seems essentially to involve. The lottery paradox connects to Gettier through the problem of knowledge of conjunction. You know that ticket 1 will not win. You know that ticket 2 will not win. You know this for each ticket individually, because the probability of any ticket winning is negligible, but you cannot know that some ticket will win. Even though you know this must be true, and this seems wrong, seems like knowledge should be closed under conjunction, should allow you to put together things you know into knowledge of their conjunction. But if it does, then you can know both that no particular ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these cannot both be known because they contradict. And this reveals something about the nature of knowledge, that it is not simply high probability, not simply justified belief that is very likely to be true, but something more demanding, something that excludes a certain kind of luck or chance. And this connects to Gettier because Gettier cases are cases where justified true belief holds, but knowledge fails because of luck, because of accident, because the truth was not guaranteed by the justification. And the lottery case suggests that knowledge requires guarantee, requires that the truth not be accidental. But what counts as guarantee? What excludes accident? These questions have no clear answer, no consensus, no definition that everyone accepts. Contextualism tries to solve some of these problems by saying that whether someone knows depends on context, on what alternatives are relevant, on how demanding the standards are in the conversational situation, and in ordinary contexts, knowledge is easy to have, requires only that obvious alternatives be ruled out. But in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are raised, where brain-in-vat possibilities are mentioned, the standards rise and knowledge becomes harder or impossible to have. And this explains why knowledge seems to come and go, why we are happy to say we know things in ordinary life, but hesitate when doing philosophy. But contextualism faces problems too. Problems about whether the standards really vary or whether we are just more careful in philosophical contexts. Problems about how context determines standards. Problems about disagreement between people in different contexts who seem to be making incompatible claims. And like every other approach to knowledge after Gettier, contextualism captures something, but fails to capture everything, solves some problems, but creates others, and the dialectic continues, endlessly, inconclusively. Zagzebski showed that any analysis of knowledge that adds conditions to justified true belief to avoid Gettier will face its own Gettier-style counterexamples, that there is a recipe for generating such cases. And this is a kind of meta-Gettier problem, a problem not just with the original definition, but with the entire project of modifying it. And her argument suggests that the problem is not with particular proposals, but with the form of analysis itself, with the attempt to understand knowledge as justified true belief plus something. And if she's right, then the only options are to abandon analysis entirely, as Williamson suggests, or to abandon the justified true belief framework altogether, to start from scratch with a completely different approach. And some have tried this, have proposed that knowledge is a kind of ability, that it is acquaintance with facts, that it is constituted by the safety or sensitivity of belief, that it is a matter of having conclusive reasons, and each of these departs from the traditional framework. Each tries to rethink knowledge from the ground up, but each also faces objections. Each struggles to handle the full range of cases. Each eventually generates its own literature of problems and refinements and counterexamples. The phenomenon of epistemic luck is at the heart of all this. Gettier cases are cases of epistemic luck, cases where true belief is not the result of epistemic virtue or proper cognitive functioning, but of fortunate coincidence, and knowledge excludes epistemic luck. This much seems clear, but epistemic luck comes in many forms. Veritic luck, where the truth is accidental. Evidential luck, where the evidence is accidentally good. Content luck, where the belief happens to be about something true by coincidence. And maybe knowledge is incompatible with some forms of luck, but not others. Maybe some amount of luck is inevitable in any finite cognitive system operating in an uncertain world, and the question is where to draw the line. Which kinds of luck destroy knowledge and which do not? And there seems to be no principled way to answer this. No theory that gets all the cases right. No definition that excludes exactly the right amount of luck without excluding too much or too little. Sosa's virtue epistemology tries to handle this by saying that knowledge is true, belief that is accurate because adroit, because of the exercise of cognitive ability, and Gettier cases fail because they are accurate, but not because adroit. The belief is true, but not because of skill, and this seems promising, seems to capture what goes wrong in Gettier cases, but it faces questions about what counts as ability, about whether being in a good environment is part of ability or a separate factor, about whether knowledge requires that ability be exercised in the right way, or just that it be exercised. And these questions prove difficult, generate their own debates, and the theory fragments into animal knowledge and reflective knowledge, and different grades of knowledge. And what started as a simple, elegant idea becomes complex and qualified and contested. The situationist challenge from social psychology raises doubts about whether cognitive abilities even exist, whether there are stable traits that manifest across situations, or whether behavior, including cognitive behavior, is mostly determined by situation rather than character. And if situationism is right, then virtue epistemology is based on a false assumption, based on the idea that people have stable cognitive abilities when really they have only situational responses. And this would not just undermine one theory of knowledge, but would call into question the entire picture of knowledge as something stable, something dispositional, something that inheres in persons rather than emerging from person-situation interactions. And while most epistemologists have not taken situationism seriously, have not fully grappled with its implications, it represents a potential crisis, a challenge from outside philosophy that could overturn assumptions epistemology has relied on for centuries. The Gettier problem has become emblematic of philosophy's condition, of its inability to solve problems definitively, to reach consensus, to make progress in the way sciences do, and critics point to 60 years of post-Gettier epistemology as evidence that philosophy is confused, that it asks questions that have no answers, that it pursues definitions that cannot be given, and defenders respond. That philosophy is hard, that concepts like knowledge are genuinely complex, that the lack of consensus is not failure, but the nature of inquiry into fundamental questions. But the defense sounds hollow after decades of effort that have produced no solution, no widely. The face is unknown, is never seen directly, is accessible only through reflection, through surfaces that show what cannot be seen from the position of seeing. And this mediation is so fundamental, so early, so constant in modern life that it becomes invisible, becomes assumed, becomes the unnoticed foundation of self-recognition, of the sense that there is a self, that this self has a face, that the face is mine, is me, is the visible representation of what I am. But the representation requires the mirror, requires the surface, requires the external reflection that shows what the eyes cannot see, cannot access, cannot know without mediation. And the mediation is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what the children grew without. And the growing without mirrors, without reflective surfaces, without any way to see themselves, produced children who at age 5, at age 7, at age 10, could not recognize themselves in photographs, could not identify their faces in videos, could not point to themselves in group pictures, could not distinguish their own image from the images of others. And the others were recognized, were identified, were known by face, but the self was not, was absent from visual recognition, was not integrated into the sense of identity, was not part of what it meant to be oneself. And oneself was different for these children, was not anchored in appearance, was not attached to face, was not incorporating the visual self that mirrors create, that reflections provide, that external mediation makes available. And the available is what was withheld, is what the experiment denied, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual component that is considered essential, that is assumed to be natural, that is treated as automatic, but is really learned, is acquired, is the result of repeated exposure to reflection, to the surfaces that show the face, that make the self visible, that create the connection between the feeling of being and the image of appearing. And the appearing is what these children never saw, never knew, never integrated into identity. And identity was therefore different, was organized around other features, around voice, around proprioception, around the feeling of being in a body without the visual confirmation, without the external validation, without the reflection that says this is what you look like, this is your face, this is who you are. And the R was not visual, was not based on appearance, was not incorporating the face as part of self. And the self was coherent, was stable, was functioning, was not damaged or diminished, but was different, was showing that the visual self is not necessary, is not essential, is not the foundation of identity, but is one component, is one way of knowing oneself, is the way that cultures with mirrors create, that societies with reflective surfaces enforce, that modernity assumes to be universal, but is really contingent, is really dependent on technology, on the availability of surfaces that reflect. And the reflecting is recent, is not ancient, is not something that most humans, for most of history, had access to in the form that is now constant, now ubiquitous, now shaping identity from infancy, from the earliest moments when the child sees the face in the mirror and begins the process of recognition, of connecting the image to the self, of incorporating the visual into identity. And the incorporating is learned, is not automatic, is not innate, is requiring repeated exposure, repeated confirmation, repeated pairing of the feeling of being with the image of appearing. And the pairing is what creates self-recognition, is what makes the face feel like mine, is what integrates the visual self into the sense of identity. And the identity that forms without this pairing is different, is not including the face, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing the self in images. And the images are what the experiment tested, is what revealed the absence, is what showed that these children could not identify themselves, could not see themselves, could not recognize the face that was theirs because the face had never been known, had never been seen, had never been integrated into the sense of who they were. And who they were was stable, was coherent, was not fragmented or confused except in the specific domain of visual self-recognition. And the recognition was absent, was not developed, was not present, and the presence of self was therefore different, was not including the visual component, was not based on the face, was organized around other features, other ways of knowing, other modes of self-awareness, and the awareness was intact, was functional, was demonstrating that the self does not require the visual, does not need the face, does not depend on mirrors. And mirrors are what create the visual self, are what make the face known, are what integrate appearance into identity. And the integration is what was missing, is what the experiment prevented, is what the conditions eliminated. And the elimination revealed something fundamental about selfhood, about identity, about the role of reflection in creating the sense of being a person, of having a face, of being recognizable. And the recognizable is what these children were not. Were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in photographs or videos or any visual representation. And the representation is what others used, is what others relied on, is what the culture assumed to be universal, to be automatic, to be the natural way of identifying people. But the natural was shown to be cultural, was shown to be learned, was shown to be dependent on mirrors, on reflections, on the external surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the self without this connection is different, is not including the visual, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing itself in mirrors. And mirrors are what the children were eventually shown, is what was introduced after years of deprivation, after identity had formed without reflection. And the formation was complete, was stable, was not including the expectation of seeing oneself, was not anticipating recognition. And so when the mirror was presented, when the reflection appeared, the children did not recognize themselves, did not see themselves, saw instead a stranger, saw another person, saw someone who was not them. And the not them was what the face was, is what the image was, is what the reflection showed. And the showing was not connecting, was not integrating, was not creating recognition, because the foundation had not been laid, the pairing had not occurred, the repeated exposure had not happened, and so the face remained unknown, remained other, remained someone else's face, and whose face was a question they could not answer, could not determine, could not figure out through observation, because observation alone is not sufficient, is not creating recognition, is requiring the pairing, the connection, the learned association between feeling and image, between being and appearing. And the appearing was not theirs, was not them, was not integrated into identity. And identity was therefore split, was separated between the felt self and the visual self, between who they knew themselves to be and who they appeared to be. And the appearing was stranger, was other, was not recognized. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection develops, is what repeated exposure produces. But the exposure had not occurred, the development had not happened, the recognition was not present, and the present was strange, was disorienting, was revealing that the face is not naturally known, is not automatically recognized, is not inherently connected to self, but is learned, is acquired, is the result of cultural practice, of technological mediation, of the availability of mirrors. And mirrors are recent, are modern, are not something that most humans throughout history had in the form that is now constant. And the constant is what creates recognition, is what integrates the face, is what makes the visual self part of identity. And identity, without this integration, is different, is not based on appearance, is not including the face, is organized around other features. and the features are sufficient, are adequate, are creating stable selfhood without the visual component. And the component is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what revealed the contingency of self-recognition, the learned nature of face identity, the cultural foundation of the visual self, and the self that forms without mirrors is coherent, is functional, is demonstrating that appearance is not essential to selfhood, that the face is not necessary for identity, that recognition is not natural but is learned, is acquired, is the product of reflection, of mediation, of the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what the children knew themselves, is how they experienced being, is the proprioceptive, the auditory, the tactile, the ways of knowing that do not require reflection, that do not depend on mirrors, that are available without mediation. And the mediation is what the visual requires, is what the face needs, is what makes self-recognition possible, and the possible is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be cultural, to be the result of. Conditions that can be present or absent, and the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who know themselves but do not recognize themselves, who are themselves but do not appear to be themselves, who exist as subjects but not as visual objects. And the objects are what mirrors create, are what reflections produce, are what the external mediation makes available, and the available is what these children lacked, is what the experiment withheld, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual self, and the self was complete, was intact, was not diminished but was different, was showing that the mirror is not reflecting what is there but is creating what is recognized, is producing the visual self, is making the face part of identity, and identity is flexible, is variable, is forming around whatever is available, whatever is provided, whatever is repeated enough to become integrated. And the integrated is what the visual self is in normal conditions, is what the face becomes through reflection, is what mirrors produce. But the production is not automatic, is not guaranteed, is not happening without the conditions, without the exposure, without the repeated pairing that creates recognition. And recognition is what makes the face mine, is what integrates appearance into identity, is what connects the image to the self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is showing that selfhood is not given but is made, is not discovered but is constructed, is not natural but is the product of specific conditions, specific technologies, specific cultural practices, and the practices include mirrors, include reflections, include the constant availability of surfaces that show the face, and the face is what becomes known through showing, is what becomes self through reflection, is what becomes mine through recognition. And recognition requires mirrors, requires surfaces, requires the external mediation that these children lacked, that the experiment withheld, that created the conditions where identity formed without the visual self, where the face remained other, where self-recognition was absent, and the absence was revealing, was demonstrating, was showing that the self is not what it seems, is not naturally visual, is not automatically including the face, but is constructed through reflection, through mediation, through the mirrors that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is not automatic, that identity requires reflection, requires mirrors, requires the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what matters, is what is felt, is what is known without mediation. And the mediation is what creates the visual, is what produces the face, is what makes self-recognition possible. and the possible is contingent, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, of reflections, of the external mediation that shows the face and creates the connection. And the connection is what these children lacked, is what the experiment prevented, is what revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but is integrated through reflection, through mirrors, through the mediated surfaces that show what the eyes cannot see, and the seeing is what creates recognition, is what produces the visual self, is what makes the face mine, and mine is what the face was not for these children, was not in images, was not in reflections, was not recognized because recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external mediation that creates the visual self, that integrates appearance into identity, that makes selfhood include the face. And the face is what these children never knew, never saw, never recognized. And the recognizing is what mirrors do, is what reflection creates, is what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on conditions that can be present or absent. And the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who are themselves but do not know themselves visually, who exist but do not recognize themselves, who have faces but have never seen them. And the seeing is what makes the face part of self, is what creates recognition, is what mirrors produce, and mirrors are what the children lacked, are what the experiment withheld, are what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mediation, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the self that forms without this reflection is different, is not including appearance, is not based on face, is organized around other ways of knowing, other modes of awareness, and the awareness is sufficient, is creating stable identity, is demonstrating that the visual self is not essential, is not necessary, is not the foundation of selfhood, but is one component, one way of knowing, one mode of recognition. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but becomes part through reflection, through mirrors, through the external mediation that shows what cannot be seen directly. And the directly is what the children knew, is how they existed, is the selfhood without the visual. And the visual is what requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external surfaces that create recognition, that integrate appearance, that make the face part of identity, and identity is what forms without mirrors. When mirrors are absent, when reflection is unavailable, when the conditions prevent the development of visual self-recognition, and the recognition is absent, is not developed, is showing that the self does not require the face, that identity does not need appearance, that selfhood can form without the visual component, and the component is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be learned, to be the product of external mediation. And mediation is what creates the visual self, what integrates the face, what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is not automatic, is not natural, is the product of repeated exposure to reflection, to the mirrors that make the face known, that integrate appearance into identity, that create the visual self, and the self without this integration is different, is coherent, is stable, is demonstrating that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is forming around whatever is available, and what was available to these children was everything except mirrors, except reflection, except the visual self. And the visual self is what requires external mediation, what depends on mirrors, what these children never developed because they never saw themselves, never knew their faces, never recognized themselves in images, and the images are what others use to identify them, what the culture assumes to be natural, what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on mirrors, on reflection, on the external surfaces that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make self-recognition possible. And the possible is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, and mirrors are what create the visual self, what make the face part of identity, what these children lacked and the lacking revealed. That selfhood without mirrors is different, is possible, is coherent, is demonstrating that the self does not require reflection to exist, only to be recognized visually. And visual recognition is what mirrors create, what these children never achieved, what the experiment showed to be contingent, cultural, learned, and learned is what self-recognition is, what the face becomes, what identity includes when mirrors are present, when reflection is available, when external mediation creates the visual self, and the self is what these children had without it, is what formed differently, is what demonstrated that identity formation requires external reflection only if visual self-recognition is the goal, and the goal is cultural, is modern, is contingent on mirrors, and mirrors are what these children lacked, are what the experiment removed, are what revealed that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is formed around whatever is reflected back, and what was reflected back was nothing, was absence, was the lack of visual self, and the lack created different identity, created selfhood without face, created children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never integrated into identity, and identity was different, was complete, was demonstrating that the self does not require the face to be the self, only to recognize the self visually. And visual recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires external mediation, and mediation is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that selfhood includes the face only when mirrors are present, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is contingent, and contingent is what the visual self is, what the face is, what recognition is, and recognition is what these children lacked, is what mirrors create, is what the experiment showed to require external reflection, and reflection is what makes identity include the face, what makes selfhood visual, what makes the self recognizable, and recognizable is what these children were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in mirrors when mirrors were finally shown, and the showing did not create recognition, because recognition requires learning, requires pairing, requires the repeated exposure that these children never had, and the never having revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is learned, that self-recognition is cultural, that mirrors create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never became, and became is what they were without it, were different selves, were identities without faces, were children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that create recognition, and recognition is what mirrors make, what reflection produces, what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed the truth, revealed the contingency, revealed that identity formation requires external reflection.